Oh, hey there! You know, sometimes I feel it's important to revisit projects or ideas that you may have worked on years ago to see if you can improve upon them, or if you can get inspiration to build something new. With Konami's final entry into the Castlevania franchise on the Nintendo DS, I feel like they did just that. That's right, this is just another video about Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. If you've watched any of my previous Java entries, you know that I typically like to talk about the development and then maybe talk about how I personally found the game if it's an interesting enough story, and then I go into what the game actually is. But I'm gonna level with you. Developmental history of Order of Ecclesia is pretty hard to find. That's not to say that there isn't a story there, but from the digging that I did, I just couldn't really find all that much that was really that interesting to talk about. It was made by the same dev team as Portrait of Ruin, and its announcement was a bit delayed to allow another Castlevania game to have its time in the spotlight. That game being Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles on the PSP, which yes, I will cover one day. I would like to say that the character artist this time around is different than the artist for Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin. It's still not Ayami Kojima, mind you, meaning the characters do not retain that signature gothic look of earlier Castlevania entries. Instead, the character art was done by Haruka Misaki this go around, and honestly, I have to say I'm a fan. The art and designs are somewhere between Ayami Kojima style and the signature anime style used by the previous two games. All in all, I think it just fits the aesthetic that this particular game is trying to go for. As for the music, I'm not one to shy away from Michiru Yamane's work, and oh man did she do a fantastic job here. I'd say overall, the soundtrack in Order of Ecclesia is probably better than Portrait of Ruin. I praised that game's audio too, but the big difference are the set pieces used in Portrait lead to a lot more tropey sounding tracks. Funny circus clown music, your typical desert tracks. As I said in the previous video, it all fits. However, if I was just listening to the Portrait of Ruin OST, those are the tracks that I would probably skip. Whereas if I was listening to the full Order of Ecclesia soundtrack, I can't think of a single track off the top of my head that I would skip. Sometimes I want to go into more detail about all these songs in these games and just talk about them endlessly, but it would make the videos way too long. But the next time you have some free time and you're not actively watching and subscribing to my channel, look up the OST and give it a listen. Anyway, Order of Ecclesia was released in October in 2008, and actually came out 2 days earlier in the US than it did in Japan for some reason. But yeah, development-wise, it's just hard to find information about this game. I'm sure you probably could if you could translate some old Japanese magazines or something, but we'll save that for the likes of Did You Know Gaming, and I'll just talk about what the game actually is. So this is where I would typically say, being a Metroidvania game, you once again explore a large castle filled with enemies. You obtain new abilities that act as keys to allow you to progress to new parts of the castle. But they did things quite a bit differently this time around, and honestly, that's noticeable right off the bat. The exact time that this game takes place in isn't clear, but we do know that it takes place after Symphony of the Night, but most likely before Bloodlines, and the long era where the Belmonts had disappeared, so various other vampire hunters and organizations sprang up to try to keep evil at bay. You take the role of Shinoa, a member of the Order of Ecclesia, an organization that invented a magic called Glyphs, which users bound to their bodies to perform magical and standard attacks. But we'll get into more detail about those in just a bit. Shinoa was chosen by the leader of Ecclesia, a man named Barlow, to inherit their most powerful glyph, Dominus, which could be used to destroy Dracula's vessel. However, before she was able to complete the ritual, it's interrupted by her childhood friend Albus. He steals Dominus for himself and flees, leaving Shinoa with no memories and no emotions. From here, Barlow tasks you with going off to find Albus and retrieve Dominus. You leave Ecclesia and you're brought to a map screen. Yep. This is one of the biggest changes brought to the table by Order of Ecclesia, and that a large portion of the game takes place outside of Castlevania. Now, this isn't the first Castlevania game to have locations outside of the castle. And in fact, quite a few games have stages that lead up to the castle, such as Castlevania 3 or Castlevania Rondo of Blood, but the one that comes to mind the most would of course be Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. Now, I'm far from the first person to make this comparison, but I truly believe that Order of Ecclesia was everything that Simon's Quest wanted to be, but without the limitations of the NES and being developed in the 80s. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the ideas used were inspired by the paintings in Portrait of Ruin as well. Like maybe Iga and his team were just kind of testing the waters with having locations outside of Castlevania, and with this game they just decided to fully embrace that. But that's all speculation on my part. So how does this work? Well, when you first view the map, you only have two choices as to where you can go: back into Ecclesia or off to the monastery to chase down Albus. Selecting the monastery will bring you to a new location to explore. This is where the whole full of enemies and abilities that act as keys to unlock new areas comes back into play. The entire game is broken up into multiple locations and set pieces sprawling out across the land. As you explore each one, the map will open up further and further. The zones themselves range from rather linear and straightforward to your more traditional open exploration design. For the most part, you'll enter from one side of the stage and exit from the other, and by doing so, you'll unlock a new location on the map. Some of these locations have their own bosses while others do not, but almost all of them contain a variety of enemies to overcome and defeat, and have various treasures to find. Some locations will even have their own teleporters in them to help you navigate if you wish to revisit to explore areas you might have missed, or that might have been previously inaccessible to you. Before talking more about exploration though, we should really go over the second big change to this game, a term I brought up earlier: glyphs. I'm just gonna say this right now, my personal feelings on these are pretty mixed. I think the idea is cool and the execution is fine, but they also feel lacking at times. Unlike every previous Castlevania game, Shinoa doesn't get any sort of standard weapons. She has no whip, she has no sword, she only has glyphs. These take the place of both your standard weapons and your sub-weapons in a system that I could probably best describe as a little awkward at times. Throughout the course of the game, you'll come across various glyphs, which Shinoa can absorb into her body by holding up on the D-pad. Once absorbed, you'll have it forever. There are two types of glyphs. The first are attached to Shinoa's arms and are equipped to the Y and the X buttons. There are 50 of these types of glyphs. These are your main attacks and take the place of your standard weapons and sub-weapons. Secondly are the back glyphs, which are equipped to the R button. These are typically more supportive based, allowing you to buff certain stats or make adjustments to your mobility. Some will allow you to transform into different forms or summon familiars that fight by your side. There are 23 of this type of glyph. Once an attack glyph is obtained, you can equip it to either the X or the Y button, or both if you'd like. You only need a single glyph to equip it to both slots, so you don't have to worry about tracking down two of everything. These glyphs take the form of some of your more traditional Castlevania weapons and sub-weapons, such as swords, thrown axes, hammers, etc. However, there are also some magical attacks peppered in as well, like shooting fire or balls of light. Each press of the attack button will actually drain your MP by a set amount per glyph. However, unlike the previous games, your MP bar refills quite quickly. So why would you equip two of the same weapon on X and Y? Well, because you can do this. Shinoa is capable of rapidly firing off attacks by alternating between the X and Y buttons. This isn't the first time a Castlevania game has allowed you to equip a weapon on either hand, as this was initially done all the way back in Symphony of the Night, but it is the first time you've been able to attack so fluidly while doing so. It really feels like the game is banking on you to do this, and for the most part, attacking this way feels pretty good. It has its pros and cons, of course. Some weapons, such as rapiers, feel especially nice, as the attacks come out quickly and chain together in a satisfying way. The fire spell also has a similar feel to it, whereas slower weapons such as hammers just aren't nearly as satisfying. It still works, but again, albeit much slower. Something to keep in mind is that you simply can't just mash the buttons back and forth as fast as you can to do this. There has to be a sense of rhythm to it. As stated before, some weapons do attack faster, allowing you to mash a bit faster, but if you do try to go too fast, Shinoa will instead lag between hits, which can be pretty costly or just downright frustrating. I'm not sure if it was my buttons not being as responsive as they should have been, or an issue with the game, but I did seem to have issues from time to time where even with the most basic alternating speed, it just didn't feel responsive. It didn't matter what speed I was doing it at, sometimes Shinoa would just not attack when I wanted her to. This very well could have been a weird button issue on my end, but at the same time, I didn't really have issues with the responsiveness when I would just do a single attack here and there, so I'm not really sure. This form of attacking can either feel really good or not at all. And the constant drain on your MP is kind of annoying, as you can't be nearly as offensive as you may want to be. In previous games, I'd like to get in close and cancel my attack animation with short hops and backdashes. It always felt really good, and I could be as aggressive as I wanted to be. But in this game, you may find a really good rhythm, but then you run out of MP and you can no longer attack. So you either just sit there and do nothing, or you retreat and wait for it to fill back up before you can even attack again. This can become increasingly cumbersome in situations where you use your attack defensively to take care of enemy projectiles while you work your way towards them. Every swing of your weapon drains your MP. It doesn't matter if you hit or not. So by the time you get close to an enemy, you might have already run out of MP and you can no longer attack. That being said, is there a benefit to having two different attacks on your X and Y buttons? Well, yes, actually. You won't be able to attack as fluidly or as fast, but the trade-off is that you'll be able to perform powerful glyph unions. A union glyph combines both your X and Y glyphs into a single powerful attack. This is where those classic Castlevania hearts come into play. as each union glyph costs a set amount of hearts to perform. Unlike your MP, these do not refill on their own and instead are refilled by breaking candles to collect more or using items. There are 31 union glyphs in total. You can still use 2 of the same weapon for these, so for instance, using 2 swords will perform a union glyph where Shinoa swings a giant sword, or using 2 fire glyphs will cause Shinoa to shoot off a much larger burst of fire. But there are also other combinations that can be performed, such as combining a weapon with one of the various elemental glyphs to attack with a large elemental weapon of some sort, or mixing 2 elements to create an explosion. Even if 2 glyphs aren't compatible to perform something unique, Shinoa will still perform a decently strong hitting union glyph that shoots out a white burst of energy. If you've seen my Circle of the Moon video, you may remember that I said Koji Igarashi did not work in that game, and in fact, he was not a fan of it. But I feel that the DSS system from that game was a big inspiration for the glyph unions in this game. Again, that's pure speculation on my part, but I mean, come on. Glyphs are found by defeating certain enemies. You'll know if an enemy has a chance to drop a glyph when, upon defeat, a small bit of colored light appears and disappears. If you keep defeating said enemy, that light will eventually reform into a full glyph to be absorbed by Shinoa. Other glyphs are found in these special statues which can be destroyed. Lastly, there are enemy attacks where, if you watch closely, you'll see an enemy summon a glyph to attack you. If you wait too long, the spell will be completed and you'll have to dodge the attack. But if you're quick enough, you can stop and absorb the glyph for your own, preventing the attack. When it comes to the glyph system, I'm honestly a bit conflicted. I feel like when I first played this game all the way back in 2008, it didn't bother me as much. But revisiting it now, especially after just coming off the heels of the previous 2 DS Castlevania games, it definitely feels lacking at times. 73 seems like a lot of glyphs, until you realize that the total amount of attacks and sub-weapons you're going to get in this game. And a lot of them are just repeats of each other. Keep in mind, in Portrait of Ruin, Jonathan has 29 sub-weapons and Charlotte had 42 spells. On top of this, they both had quite a lot of weapons that could be found and used as well. In Dawn of Sorrow, you had over 100 different souls at your disposal, as well as numerous weapons and weapon types to be found. And well, as I just said, a lot of these glyphs are just repeats of each other. Let's toss out the word glyph for a second and just call the weapon glyphs what they are: weapons. There are 27 different weapons, but since each weapon type has 3 stages to it, that means there's actually only 9 different weapon types. Now, 9 weapon types isn't a bad thing until you realize there's only 3 forms of each one and they're all practically the same. So when you start the game, you'll get a sword, and a little bit later on you'll get a slightly stronger sword, and then eventually you'll get the strongest form of sword. That's it. 3 swords, 3 rapiers, 3 hammers. Hell, I was actually being generous when I said that there was 27 different weapons with 9 different weapon types, because that actually included the axes, which are just your standard Castlevania sub-weapon. And that also included the knives, which are also just your standard Castlevania sub-weapon. In fact, that also included the shields, which you can't even attack with. So if we just view those for what they are, as sub-weapons, then that means you only have 18 weapons with 6 different types. I'm sure that it sounds like I'm splitting hairs here, but the point that I'm making is that there isn't much variety across this rather large game. Imagine playing Castlevania Symphony of the Night, or Aria of Sorrow, or Dawn of Sorrow, and there only being 3 swords for the entire game. And not only are there only 3 swords, but they're all 3 the exact same weapon with slightly different stats. In previous games, you could find all sorts of different swords with different properties or different critical arts, different elements to allow you to mix and match them. That just doesn't exist here. Sure, you could make an elemental sword with union glyphs, but that's going to cost you hearts and they're going to run out real quick. What it really boils down to is that the system just feels lacking, because your normal attacks, sub-weapons, and spells have all been rolled into one thing. That also means that you will never find a weapon just sitting out after you broke a wall and found a secret area. No longer do you even have the chance that an enemy will drop some sort of cool and unique weapon for you to use by simply defeating them, which makes grinding enemies less rewarding. And this isn't like the Sorrow games where every enemy drops a soul, as really there aren't that many glyphs even obtained from enemies. So again, fighting enemies just feels less rewarding overall. As per the norm with previous Castlevania games, there are relics this go around, but nowhere near as many as Portrait. There are 6 relics, with only 2 of them being new movement tech, which consists of the double jump and the ability to sink in water. That's it. No super jump this go around. And instead, the other movement tech Shinoa gets is tied yet again to the glyph system. Early on, you can get the ability to generate a magnetic field by holding down R. Certain rooms will have these round metal pieces that Shinoa can magnetize herself to. As long as you hold R, she will stay on or near it, and you can move in a circle around the object. Depending on the direction you hold on the D-pad, for instance, if you hold down, Shinoa will move down away from the metal object. Releasing the R button in this position will send Shinoa flying in the opposite direction. It's honestly pretty cool, but I do wish it had been utilized a bit more across the game. There's a hidden training grounds area that makes good use of this, and a platforming gauntlet that perhaps inspired Hollow Knight's Path of Pain, but for the most part you don't see them too much. Eventually she gets a glyph that lets her grow wings and fly around, again with the press of the R button. This is basically the replacement for the super jump. On the one hand, it's pretty fun to fly around and attack things, but at the same time, once you get the glyph for speed up, you kinda don't want to take it off because moving at high speeds just feels good. But without wings, you can't reach the higher places, because there is no super jump this go around. It just feels a bit cumbersome swapping between high movement speed and flying, whereas in the previous two games, you could do both, run at high speeds and super jump. The simple solution here would have just been to tie the wings to the L button. One of the other relics you get is the Glyph sleeve, which allows you to hold the A button down and cycle through 3 equipped Glyph loadouts. Soma actually had something similar in the Sorrow games, but I didn't really use it there, so I didn't think to talk about it. But in Order of Ecclesia, it's basically mandatory to have 3 loadouts at all times, due to the fact that enemies can be pretty difficult if you try attacking them with a weapon they are strong against. So you typically want to have some sharp weapons, blunt weapons, and magic weapons and just swap between them as you go. The thing is though, I still found myself constantly pausing and changing my loadouts while playing, because I need something other than the 3 that I had, which only made cycling them more tedious because you start forgetting what you had equipped, and yeah, it can be a bit much to say the least. Occasionally you'll get a cool rhythm down where you seamlessly swap between loadouts, taking down various enemies, and it does feel good, but I feel like for first time players, most people will just end up using a single loadout and then pausing and equipping what they need whenever they need to. After you beat the monastery, you'll unlock Weigel Village on the map, which acts as a sort of central hub or a home base for you to check in on from time to time. When you first arrive, it's rather barren with almost no people to be found, but over the course of the game, you'll slowly find and rescue each of the 13 villagers in Weigel, all of which serve some sort of purpose. The village is where you find this game's shop. This go around, as opposed to the shop getting new items over the course of the game, instead you need to perform various quests given to you by the NPCs of the village after rescuing them. Doing so will not only reward you with various items, but will also add more inventory to be purchased from the shop itself. And yes, I said quests. They make a return from Portrait of Ruin. In that game, there were 37, whereas in this one they've reduced that down to 35. But there's a lot more variety in them this go around. Each villager you speak with has various quests for you to partake in. They range from bringing them certain rare items or going to set locations they describe to paint a picture to show them, or even recording the sounds of certain enemies. I will say the quests in this game are a bit more varied than those in Portrait of Ruin, but at the same time, I also found myself forgetting about them more often. I think the main reason for that is due to the fact that the quest lines were spread across 13 various NPCs. So it's easy to simply forget about them, whereas in Portrait of Ruin, the quests were only given and turned into one NPC, so you'd often just check to see if there were more once you finished completing whatever task you were sent on. Much of the game involves chasing Albus around the map from one location to another, while taking the occasional pit stop back to Weigel to heal up and turn in your quests. As for the rest of the locations, there are 19 areas in total, which does seem like quite a lot, but some of them are completely linear, as in, it's just a straight line you walk in until you reach the end. Some of the larger maps do have some room for exploration, such as the Calidus Channel or the Tamio Mountains, but I can't help but feel that a lot of these locations are just a bit small. And it makes me wish that they had actually leaned a little harder into the Simon's Quest side of things. I think this could have been improved by removing the map screen altogether, because it really does kill your sense of immersion every time you have to go back to the map after you beat an area. You could still return to each stage if they just placed a teleporter in between where 2 stages connect. If the whole game was just one large area for you to explore, it would feel so much more immersive. Instead, every area feels like they are shown on the map, just disconnected from each other and floating in the void. At one point, you're told you need to take a trip out to Manira Prison Island. To get there, first you must go through the Ruvus Forest and then the Calidus Channel. The problem is, for both of these locations, you literally just walk in a straight line. You enter on the left side, walk for a few screens to the right, and exit. And where do you end up? Right back at the world map. So that means you work your way through the forest, then go to the map. Work your way through the Calidus Channel, then go to the map. Then finally you're able to enter the Manira Prison Island. Think about how much cooler this progression could have been without constantly going back to the map after a couple of screens. They could have added a couple of extra screens per map to make them flow into one another a bit better, and it would have made the whole world feel more connected. Also, just to fix some of the linearity, it would have been nice to have maybe a couple of random branching paths here and there on the way through the forest. Nothing too wild, but enough to make it feel like you're going through a forest and not just walking along a path. I know this is something people may not agree with me on here, but these little flaws just make me think that when it came to its open world design, Simon's Quest actually might have done it better than Order of Ecclesia. For years, I used to describe Order of Ecclesia as everything Simon's Quest would have been if it had been made 20 years later than what it was, and for the most part, I do think that statement still stands. But having played both games recently, as well as Infernax earlier this year, another game that takes quite heavy inspiration from Simon's Quest, it made me realize that I'm just not a big fan of this unnecessary map screen. So how about the locations themselves? Well, outside of their size, I do think a lot of these maps are pretty fun to explore. The artwork is really nice, and it's just fun to explore the world outside of the titular castle. I'm a big fan of the mountain areas, as they definitely feel the most unique. All in all, the locations are fun, even if they do feel a bit random at times. For instance, why is there a skeleton cave? Who knows, but it's neat. This location definitely feels like it should have been in the basement of Castlevania, but instead, it's just kind of a random location to explore that's connected to another random forest. But speaking of the titular castle, it wouldn't be a Castlevania game without Castlevania, so yes, it is here too. However, it's only accessible to you if you've taken the correct steps to get you the good ending of the game. Just like the previous two games, this does have a good and bad ending. The bad ending is achieved if you don't rescue all 13 villagers. I won't go into details for spoilers' sake, but essentially, if you defeat a certain boss without having rescued all 13 villagers, the game just abruptly ends and rolls the credits. However, getting the bad ending will show you the locations of all the villagers that you missed. I think this is pretty cool because some of these villagers are pretty hidden, so it's nice to know roughly what area you need to explore next. Assuming you do find all 13 villagers, after beating that same boss, the game will continue, with Shinoa eventually reaching and storming Castlevania itself. And while it is a nice return to form, at the same time, the castle this go around just feels cramped. It is very linear, and if you compare the map layout to any of the previous Castlevania maps, you'll see exactly what I mean. It doesn't have nearly as many branching paths or large open rooms compared to its predecessors, and even the normal hallways and vertical sections just feel tight, and well, like I said, cramped. It makes me wonder if it's due to some sort of data limitation the development team was dealing with when building the game, perhaps from having so many other areas and maps, but honestly, without detailed development history, again, it's pure speculation. Many of the areas reuse some of the enemies from previous areas as well, or just have this weird habit of throwing entirely two enemies into one small screen at once. The castle does still hold some secrets here and there, but towards the end of it, it really does feel like it might have been a bit rushed. But speaking of secrets, I did kind of gloss over another pretty cool aspect of the game, and that's the treasure chests. As you explore, you'll occasionally come across brown treasure chests in set locations. These contain a variety of items, such as ingredients or things you might need for quests. Each one of these chests has a chance of being green, which is considered the rare chest, and fittingly has better items, such as unique accessories. Brown and green chests respawn whenever you leave to the map and return to the area, so you can grind them out as much as you wish. There are also red chests, which typically have set items in them, such as your standard HP up, MP up, and heart max up. There are the very rare gold chests, and lastly, there are hidden blue chests, which require you to press down on the D-pad in set locations to find them. The treasure chest mechanic is pretty neat, as it adds just a little extra variety to finding items. Before I talk about the bosses and the extra modes, I wanted to take a minute to talk about my own feelings on the game. Why am I doing that here and not at the very end? Well, because if you've seen my previous Castlevania videos, you know that I'm a big fan of the series, and I often talk pretty positively about them, and that comes from a place of passion. If you binged my previous videos and then watched this one, I expect you might get a bit of a tonal whiplash, and it might sound like I'm just complaining about this game, that I don't like it that much, but that's not the case either. When I decided to revisit these games and talk about them, I was getting really excited to replay Order of Ecclesia because I had such fond memories of it. Even playing it this most recent time, I did have fun with it. It's still a solid Castlevania title. It still looks and feels like the previous entries. Sometimes I'll take some notes of certain topics that I want to talk about while I play the game, but for the most part, I have no idea what I'm going to say until I sit down and write the script in its entirety, because I'm having too much fun just playing the game and just enjoying it in the moment. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm just as passionate about this game as I am the previous ones I covered, but it's because of that passion that I feel like I have to be honest about parts of the game that I feel that just didn't meet their mark. It doesn't mean that I thought this was a bad Castlevania game. And I mean, at this point, I'm just kind of rambling because I guess I too didn't expect myself to be so critical of this game, and yet here we are. So let's move on to the bosses, because it's one of the spots that Order of Ecclesia really excels at. I'll just come out and say it, these bosses can be brutal. Out of the 3 DS Castlevania games, this one definitely has the hardest bosses of the group, but I think that's a good thing. For the most part, I enjoy absolutely every boss in this game. Due to MP being tied to your attacks, you can't be as aggressive as you might want to be, but this gives you time to pull back and evaluate what the boss might be doing next. The thing is though, you absolutely cannot afford to make many mistakes against any of the bosses in this game, because Shinoa basically has no invincibility frames when she takes damage. For example, see this guy? Not only do all of his attacks do a ton of damage, some even reaching triple digits, but if you make the mistake of letting yourself get backed into the corner with him, then he decides to do this, and yeah, for the most part, you can take a couple of hits from bosses before you die, and in that light, it definitely feels a lot more like it's channeling the good old days of the classic Castlevania games. There are 2 bosses in this game that I actually do dread fighting, and it's because they both have the same gimmick of wasting your goddamn time, and as you may or may not know, I'm not a big fan of that. For one of them, the fight is basically on rails. You fight a monster while constantly ascending a tower. Once you reach a certain height, there's a ceiling with the boss directly below you. You must chip away at its HP in a very limited space to do enough damage for it to smash through the ceiling so you can continue your ascent. It's slow, tedious, and if you die, you have to do it all over again. I don't mind dying to bosses, but when you can't even move at a faster pace, and it just feels like the game is playing itself for a while, it can become tiresome. The second boss in question is a giant horse named Elegy. You start off on the floor in front of its front legs and have to chip away at its weak points to eventually have it rear up on its hind legs so you can move under it. From here, you just have to wait. It walks back and forth and you have to walk back and forth with it and not get stepped on. Eventually, it will jump and allow you to get behind it. You attack its weak points again, and after those are broken, you can climb up its tail and hit its true weak point on the back of its head. The issue here is that, again, it's just very slow and tedious, made worse by the fact that he's constantly trying to throw you off of his back. When Shinoa takes a hit from him, she typically goes flying back down. If you're lucky, you might land on the backside, but if you land on the front, you have to repeat this entire process again. This fight isn't particularly hard, but it's unnecessarily punishing because of the length of time it takes to get up to his back, only for him to almost immediately try tossing you back down again. Those 2 bosses aside, the rest of the ones in the game are fantastic. If you manage to beat a boss without taking a hit, you'll be rewarded with a blue chest containing a medal. The medals don't do anything and only exist for bragging rights, but still pretty neat. As for the final boss, like my previous 2 videos, I'm not going to spoil it because I truly do believe we're going to get a DS collection at some point. That being said, it is a very fun fight, but also quite difficult and really fits the whole difficulty theme of this entire game. One of my favorite features of the final boss is that it's actually pretty reactionary to the glyphs you use. So if you try to cheese it by just flying around the room, well, just try it and see what happens. After you beat the game, you unlock some new modes. The usual suspects are here, a boss rush mode, a hard mode, and of course, a secondary playable character being Albus mode. Albus is unique in that his primary weapon of choice is the gun. Pressing Y will fire normal shots to consume the MP bar. Holding Y will rapid fire. Pressing X will fire his particle shot, which are 2 shots of holy and dark magic that move in a swirl pattern. The A button will cause Albus to use his quad Ignis attack, where he jumps into the air with a fiery spin kick. Holding up and pressing A will fire his max shot, which does lightning and dark damage. Pressing R will fire crystals for ice damage. L allows you to backdash, but if you hold up while you press it, Albus will do a super jump. This can also be performed in midair by simply pressing L. This too consumes MP for some reason, but at least he has it. Lastly is his ability to teleport. By touching the touchscreen, Albus will quickly zoom to that location. This too takes MP, but it's by far the fastest way to move and can even go through enemies and solid walls. Just like previous extra characters from the other DS games, Albus can level up by attacking enemies as well. There's no story this go around. You just run through each area to unlock the next, while eventually making your way to the final boss. His playstyle is pretty unique, so I do think he's pretty fun to play as. Something to note that I never really bothered to talk about with any of the previous games is the fact that, for some reason, Albus can't do a dive kick. Typically, characters that can double jump can also dive kick by holding down on the D-pad and pressing the jump button a 3rd time. Shinoa can do this, but for some reason Albus cannot, which just feels wrong. Order of Ecclesia is a lot. And as I stated earlier, I had no idea what I was going to write until I started writing it. And I certainly didn't expect to write more pages on this game than I did the previous 2 games. And yet, here we are. For such a long time, I used to hype this game up to myself as everything Simon's Quest would have been if it was made today. and I never really challenged myself to move past that mindset. Maybe it's because I played so many Castlevania games in such a quick succession, both for these videos and for my own entertainment. Or maybe it's because I played Infernax earlier this year, and that game really did embody everything that I wanted a Castlevania game to be nowadays. Or maybe my tastes have just changed. But I guess what I'm trying to say is Order of Ecclesia just didn't live up to the hype that I built up in my own head after not playing it for years. I still had fun, mind you, but it just wasn't as fulfilling as I thought it was going to be. I think for anyone else who's going to play this game for the first time, they're gonna really enjoy it and they're gonna have a lot of fun. The music, phenomenal. The art direction, fantastic. The overall gameplay, really fun. But where it falls short for me personally was the glyph system, trying to wrap weapons, magic, and even some relics all into one box. It becomes frustrating running out of MP fighting normal enemies and just not being able to attack. For all intents and purposes, it's just a much worse and watered down version of the Soul system from the Sorrow games, combined with a pathetically small pool of weapons to choose from. The outdoor maps are awesome, but the map screen is unnecessary, and once you reach Castlevania proper, the music is really motivating, but you quickly discover how off everything feels. An example being, once you make your way through the entrance area of the castle and through one of those classic connecting hallways, the next area, the library, plays the exact same music. Something about that always bothered me and made me think that maybe the game was a little rushed at the end. So, should you play Castlevania Order of Ecclesia? 100% yes. It's still a fun Metroidvania game, and your opinions can most certainly differ from mine. I'd put Order of Ecclesia up on a pedestal before playing it again, so it didn't live up to my own expectations, but it's still a really good game and totally worth playing. For those of you who have played it, how do you feel? Do your opinions differ from mine? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, this has been way too long, and I'm losing my voice from recording for hours on end. Plus, I've been fighting off hiccups for these last 4 pages. So that being said, my name is AJ, and this was just another video about Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. This is awful.